Hi, folks. This week on the Take On Board podcast, you're hearing from me. And this week, I wanted to talk to you about risk and risk appetite statements. Before I start, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I record. I am on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. I acknowledge their continuing connections to land, waters, skies, culture, and country. Uh, as I know I've said before, I support Voice, Treaty and Truth for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in Australia, and I encourage others in the Take On Board community to do the same. Alrighty, let's dive into our conversation. As I say, today is about risk, and it is front of mind for me because I facilitated a workshop with the board just earlier this week around their risk appetite. So I wanted to take you through the process that I often use with groups and some of the resources that I use, because risk appetite is absolutely one of those things that boards should be paying attention to. So one of the resources, I said mostly when I do these, I'll have a resource. One of the resources that I will share in the show notes is this. Setting Your Risk Appetite Supplementary Guidance. It's a publication by the Institute of Risk Management. And I always love a short and sweet. It's only 10 pages. It's got a whole lot of additional resources, and I really love the framework that they use. It says it's for risk management for charities, but I have used this for a whole range of organisations because I think, as I say, it's just a good resource. So, first up, why is risk appetite conversations important? One reason, two stories. It is firmly a board responsibility to set the risk appetite for an organisation. Much like setting the strategy, that doesn't mean you do it in the ivory tower and you just go off and do it without any input from the executive team and from other key stakeholders. But it is something that the board should set so that the team, the executive team and others, know what it is they can and can't do, or what the limits are, I guess, around that. And the conversations around risk appetite are key. So you might expect me to say this because I'm a facilitator, but I really strongly believe that these shouldn't be something done by the risk manager, shouldn't be done by the risk and audit committee, shouldn't be done by the risk and audit committee chair, should be done by the board and the executive team sitting down and having conversations about the different risk appetite categories and what's in and what's out. I'll take you through the process in a minute. Two stories, and I'm not going to share the organisations, but I want to share the themes from it. So one organisation, for them, the penny dropped around risk appetite because they'd had a major asset, sold that major asset, had some funds available, and the board had said to the leadership, to the CEO, go and come back to us with this innovative, exciting new project that we can do. The CEO, Julie, came back to the board and said, what about this? And the board went, no, not that one, too risky. What about this next month? No, not that one, too something else. There was back and forth for a couple of months, and it was a little bit frustrating for everyone, to be honest. And then in trying to work through, the board said, let's have a conversation about our risk appetite. And it was in that conversation that the penny really dropped, that what they'd been asking the CEO to do was to come with this innovative, exciting, new, fabulous proposal and project. Yet every time they came, they expected there to be no risk to the finances that were going into that. There was a mismatch of risk appetite. And they'd been asking the CEO to do the impossible, basically. So once the penny dropped on that, then they were able to say, okay, we're going to quarantine this amount of money. Please come back to us with something that is innovative and exciting, and we will approve it. I mean, obviously they weren't just going to rubber stamp, but there was alignment then around risk appetite because they were using all of these kind of high risk words, but then saying no, no, no in terms of the approval for it. So that's one example where risk appetite and having the conversation about it can really help the board and the executive team, or even the board within itself, align. The second example was let's just say a health service organisation. So a health services organisation, one of the things that health services often talk about is clinical risk. And obviously health services want to ensure that there are good clinical outcomes for patients. So the conversation started with, yep, we just want the best clinical outcomes. We will, tried and tested ways of doing it. I'm summarizing wildly. This is not all of the nuance of the conversation, but to give you a flavor. When they had more of a conversation, more of the nuance of the conversation, they also recognized that they were a research hospital, research and teaching. That involves doing new things that are not tested because you are testing. And that is in the interests of good clinical outcomes. So the risk appetite statement around that had to be carefully phrased and carefully nuanced to pick up both parts of that. So, and I think that is also an example of how whether you're doing risk management or risk appetite, always saying no risk, no risk, no risk is a risk in and of itself. You cannot have, I would say, a low appetite for everything because that is risky in and of itself. So I use those two stories often when I'm facilitating workshops as well to give boards and leadership teams a flavour of why these conversations are important. So let's dive into the process. What they recommend in this conversation about setting your risk appetite is that first up, and sometimes I do this with boards in a workshop and sometimes it's separate, but having a brainstorm about what are your key risks. Put all of them down. What are the risks about financial stuff and about having enough sustainable funding and keeping your people in place and all of those sorts of things. OC health and safety, whatever it may be. Then I get boards, and this is always on Post-it notes. I'm old school, Post-it note stuff. Then think about, of all of those risks that you've put down, what are the strategic risks? Might be key person risk. It might be, growth, mergers and acquisitions. It might be around investment. And what are our operational risks? So they might be more around, I'm thinking health and safety. Yes, all of the cords on the ground need to be covered. That is a risk, absolutely, but it's a more operational risk. There might be risks around, depending on what level they are, human resources or industrial relations risks. If it's around, negotiating the EBA, that is probably something for the operation. Might not be. It might be big enough for it to come to board. But for you and for your organisation, what are all the risks? What are the governance risks? What are the operational risks? Then put aside the operational risks. That's not for you, board. That's for the organisation to deal with. Then for the governance risk, the next part is just a bit of a heat map. You will have seen these. Let me show you the picture and I'll describe it for those that are listening instead. Something like this heat map. So what is the consequence? Is the consequence extreme, major, moderate, minor, or insignificant? And you might define those. And what is the likelihood across the bottom? Remote, unlikely, possible, probable, or highly probable. Things that are up in the top right-hand corner that are more likely and more extreme are then also where you want to focus your attention. Then finally, having done all of that thinking, dive on into your risk appetite. So risk appetite statements, my recommendation for organisations is always to have different categories for that. It's very unlikely you would have one risk appetite statement that applies to absolutely everything that an organisation does. And some of the common categories for risk appetite statement might be around strategic risk. That might be around mergers and acquisitions. It might be around innovation. It might be around partnerships, those sorts of things. I've already talked about clinical risk. If you're a healthcare organisation or a aged care organisation, then you might have clinical risk and how that applies in the organisation. Reputational risk. How much risk are we willing to take with our reputation? People risk, as I'd mentioned before, key person risk, and those big issues that are on the governance side of things. Financial risk, that is definitely often there, around what debt levels might an organisation take on, what's your risk around investment and investment returns, what's your risk appetite around budgeting and surplus budgets and deficit budgets, those sorts of things. And the other common one, and increasingly common, is around tech and cybersecurity. Might be around your risk appetite for data breaches, or for adopting AI and so on. So you might have a whole range of different categories that you will need to define a risk appetite. Then once you've got your categories, then I would say, they don't say this in the article that I'm referring to, but I like doing it. What is the risk appetite rating? And I can share these in the show notes. These are the ones that I use. First up, risk seeking. Willing to take higher risks in pursuit of greater rewards. That's the top level, I guess. Risk tolerant. Tolerant about a moderate level of risk in exchange for potential awards. Risk neutral. That's in the middle. You're hanging in the middle. Then risk cautious. Careful about taking risks and tend to favour safer options. And risk averse. Prefer to avoid risk wherever possible. So you can see why you need to have different categories, because you might be risk averse in one area, but risk seeking in another. In fact, in the examples I gave before, potentially data breaches, particularly health organisations, I would hope are risk averse, or at the very least risk cautious. Yet something about adopting AI, you might be more risk tolerant about that. So for each of the categories, tech and cybersecurity, define the different areas, data breaches, adopting AI, and give it a rating: risk-seeking, risk-tolerant, risk-neutral, risk-cautious, or risk-averse. Your work is not done there. The next part is, what does that actually mean in practice? Because it's all well and good to say that, but what does it actually mean in practice? So again, the outline, risk management and risk appetite statements, gives a bit of a table. This is in the book. It talks about what is the risk area? What does that mean we will do? What does that mean we won't do? This is where the magic is, right? This is where the conversation between executive and the board can really help to define. And again, the example I gave earlier about the health service organisation, our risk is, you're not risk seeking in every way, but we will do research. We will try new things within the confines of good research methods and so on to ensure that our patients get the best clinical care, because we know the best clinical care comes from experimenting within good confines of new technologies and new medications and new methods of doing things. So it's in those conversations that some of the gold comes. So, folks, that is the overview of how I approach risk appetite statements conversations with boards. It is an overview of what I think is this really helpful article, Setting Your Risk Appetite Supplementary Guidance from the Institute of Risk Management. I will make sure there is a link to both of those things in the show notes, both the article and the categories that I use. And folks, go forth. Check your governance calendar. If you're on a board, check your governance calendar and, when is the risk appetite review on the agenda? I don't think you necessarily need to do this full deep dive every year, but probably every 3 years is a good time of doing it, and possibly around your strategy. Having a think about your risk appetite prior to setting the strategy, doing your strategic work, and then coming back to it afterwards, I think is a pretty good rhythm. So that might be every 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, however you determine your strategy, but definitely not set and forget. Is there anything in governance that is set and forget? I don't think so. Okay, folks, that is the episode for this week. Please get in touch if you've got any tips about risk appetite and how it's played out in your organisation. Feel free to join the conversation either in the LinkedIn group or the Facebook group. And if you've got other ideas for what you would like to hear a bit more about, or any articles you would like me to share on these now shortly fortnightly episodes, please feel free to get in touch. Okay, folks, see you next week.